All right, let's talk about some of the titans of the industrial era. Let's talk about Carnegie. Let's talk about Rockefeller. Let's talk a little bit about monopolies and strategies to gain monopolies. All right, so Andrew Carnegie uh, is the guy we associate with the steel industry. So in the second industrial revolution era, this is our guy who is in charge of steel production. He's going to gain the monopoly in steel. Uh, He's going to utilize this tactic known as the Bessemer process, which is a way that makes steel production much more faster, more efficient. And when you can do it faster and more efficiently, it's going to reduce the cost of production of steel, which is going to reduce the price of steel overall. So steel is very expensive, very time consuming to make. That's why iron was the go-to sort of wonder metal at the time. That's why most of our rails and frames or whatever were made out of iron. But once steel was made more efficiently and cheaper, then that became the better metal. It's stronger, it lasts longer, it won't rust as easily. It allows you to build higher structures. That's why we get to these skyscrapers eventually because we have steel frames that they're built on. So Carnegie's a steel guy, and he's able to gain a monopoly. He's able to drive out his competitors using a tactic or strategy known as vertical integration. It's a way to gain a monopoly in which you're controlling all aspects of production from the bottom all the way to the finished product. So, for example, with iron, to make iron or to make steel, you have to have access to the iron mines itself. You have to get the raw material resources out of the ground. Carnegie had access to those. Then you have to ship that material, that raw material, to the processing plants. He had those. You have to own the steel plants. You have to own the factories, the warehouses. He had all of that. So all levels of production he controlled. He didn't have to pay outside sources to transport or to convert the raw materials. He had it all, which means he didn't have to pay those costs, which means his finished product would be cheaper than his competitors that did have to pay outside sources for other means or aspects of production. So what that means is when it comes to selling his steel, he could sell it at a cheaper price, and consumers want to pay less, not more, for their products. So certainly they're going to go with Carnegie. And as more and more people switch over to buying Carnegie's cheaper steel, that's going to drive out his competitors. Carnegie would then swoop in and buy up all their capital goods, like their access to their mines, their factories, their steel plants, which would allow him to gain more of a monopoly and expand his steel industry or steel empire. Um, that's Carnegie. That's vertical integration. Carnegie also utilized a tactic known as horizontal integration. So vertical, all the way from bottom to the top. Horizontal is focusing on controlling just one aspect of production. So once he controlled the vertical, he would then focus on just trying to buy out his competitors. So all the other steel mills and steel companies throughout the Northeast and Midwest, he was steadily buying them out. As he was able to price them out, right, undersell them, he would then buy them out, and then wouldn't have to invest in building brand new steel factories. They're already there. It's his competitors. He would just buy them out and take over what they have. This gives him further monopoly power and control. Um, JP Morgan eventually buys out Carnegie's steel company, and he renames it U.S. Steel. Carnegie had made enough money to last him a lifetime. He couldn't even spend it all in a single lifetime. And JP Morgan would continue to utilize horizontal integration to expand U.S. Steel. JP Morgan was a banker. He started out in the banking industry and made most of his wealth there. But then he expanded into the steel industry and other businesses to accumulate more wealth. Another titan of the industry was John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller is going to focus on the oil industry. Oil is another important and essential um, product during the Industrial Revolution, the Second Industrial Revolution, 1860s to the early 1900s. Oil is what makes the factories run, what eventually will make automobiles run. In the mid to late 1800s, kerosene was like a good fuel source. Oil is the raw material that would produce kerosene, gasoline, diesel fuel, all these other oil byproducts. It's also used in making paraffin. It's making asphalt, petroleum jelly, all these other byproducts that stem from the raw material of crude oil. So Rockefeller had his hands in all of those aspects of oil production, but mainly he's going to start out by focusing on the refinery aspect of oil production. Oil out of the ground, crude oil is you can't really do a whole lot with it until you process it into kerosene or gasoline. It's not that valuable. So Rockefeller realized that if he controlled the refining aspect, that's where the real money was. People had to bring the crude oil to your refinery plants in order for it to become something truly profitable. So that's where he started with the horizontal technique of controlling the refineries, and then from there he started to build and integrate vertical integration tactics to help monopolize the oil industry as well. So just to kind of recap here, monopolization tactics, these were common of Carnegie, Rockefeller, all the major industrialists were trying to gain a monopoly, trying to drive out their competitors, and they would do it through either vertical integration or horizontal integration. Both Carnegie and Rockefeller utilized both tactics. So monopolies, why is that bigger? I don't know how I did that. Whatever. Monopolies, bad for consumers. If you have the monopoly, that's great. That's good for you. But typically, when we have a monopoly, there's no more competitors, and when there's competition, prices tend to be lower. In order for people to get your business, they have to offer competitive prices. So it's good to have competition. When you're a monopoly, when you're the only uh, person in that market or only place to get a certain product, then you can start to drive up your prices. There is a cutoff point. You can't go crazy with the price increase because people will find substitute goods or alternatives. But for the most part, you can dictate, control where that price goes. The other bad side of monopolies, there's no incentive for you to further improve your products or spend money on research and development because where else are people going to go? You don't have to spend that money to make your products better. Uh, because this is bad for consumers, people and the federal government start to realize they need to rein in these monopolies. We had a very hands-off, laissez-faire approach to business. The government wanted nothing to do with it. They kind of want to just let them do their thing, and the government will stay out of it. But then they realized the downside and the drawbacks of unregulated, unchecked businesses, and they started to say, "Hey, these monopolies are bad for consumers. It's hurting people. People can't afford the higher prices, and they're not going to buy as much, which slows down the economy." So they started putting forth laws to break up and prevent monopolies. The first was in 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act, and it wasn't all that great. It wasn't largely enforced. Many of the corporations simply ignored it. And it wasn't until the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 until we start to see the Sherman Act gain some teeth. It starts to take hold, and it's actually starting to be enforced. The breaking up of these monopolies. We also see the creation of the Federal Trade Commission in 1914. This law, creates an actual agency that their whole job is to oversee business and to make sure monopolies don't exist. They're also going to make sure that collusion doesn't exist. Collusion is when businesses are secretly working together. They can set prices, like they're not trying to fairly compete with one another. If they're all working together, they can sort of drive out their competitors too. So they're just trying to make sure that the markets are fair, that businesses are being conducted fairly. They're also going to oversee the yeah, they're going to oversee the standards for packaging and for labeling, and to make sure that what is being advertised, the products that are put out there, are actually doing what they are supposed to be doing. So, like food, drugs, medicine, that sort of stuff. Uh, it was pretty easy back then to get away with false advertisement, that sort of stuff. So the FTC steps in to oversee and regulate that sort of stuff. All right, so that's kind of our introduction to two of the big names, Carnegie, Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan too, and their tactics for monopolizing horizontal and vertical integration, and a little rundown of some of the federal actions to rein in these monopolies: Sherman Antitrust Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act, and the Federal Commission Act, all means and ways to preventing monopolies.